Good morning, everyone. This is Sandy Cashmark, Executive Director, extending a welcome from Central Minnesota Manufacturers Association and from Tri-State Manufacturers Association. My office is partnered with MPMA to bring you this webinar series called Manufacturing Solutions to COVID-19 Challenges. In response to feedback we're hearing from our members, our intent with this webinar series is, of course, to provide content that's geared toward and especially useful for manufacturers. Thank you for joining us today for session 3 with a focus on manufacturing supply chain solutions. Welcome.
All right, thank you, Sandy, and good morning again. One key item I want to touch on this morning is the idea of sustained essential operations. Most of you are probably still operational because you support an essential market or essential customers. However, at any given moment, all of us are at risk of our labor becoming incapacitated or that of our supply chain. One positive COVID-19 case could mean you need to quarantine a large number of your staff that may already be short-handed. This may happen to your suppliers as well. I highly encourage you, whether you are at full capacity or at some point and may need additional resources, or if you are seeing a slowdown in work and can step up to take on additional work, to go to Medical Alley's Resource Connect or the Minnesota Chamber's Minnesota Supplier Match. Both of these are simple methods to enter your information, and then they will work hard to connect you. Medical Alley is of course more geared towards medical device OEMs finding medical suppliers for essential products, and Minnesota Chamber is perhaps better suited for connecting within the supply chain. However, both are partnering to work together. One note is that the Minnesota Chamber has opened up their supplier match to all companies, whether you're a member of the Minnesota Chamber or not. So despite what the page currently says, you do not need to be a chamber member. You actually don't need to even create a login to actually just go in and search. So when you go to their website, simply click the login button, and I encourage you to reach out to their staff member, Sean O'Neill, whose information is included here. He is directly helping companies make those connections. Some just quick examples of situations I think would make sense to reach out to these resources. One actual example is a distillery that shifted gears to produce hand sanitizer. Many of you heard about those examples, but one of those companies had no experience with packaging, so they needed a packaging supplier and reached out to the chamber for that support. Another example is if a machine shop is making components for ventilators, but they're short on machinists due to several individuals staying at home to a quarantine, and they're looking for additional labor support. Or another example is if a foundry is extremely busy in fabrication or in the actual foundry side of their business, but is slow in the milling and secondary operations side of their business and can take on additional projects. I would also encourage you to find partners in your area. Reach out to your competitors or your peers, reach out to backup suppliers, and establish communication or perhaps a plan for supporting each other. At some point in the next few weeks, all of us are going to run short on resources, making everyone that much more essential. If you don't have a backup plan, you'll find yourself scrambling. And on some legislative notes, the state legislature is currently on recess, but of course still discussing ways to provide more support and potentially being able to do some more things through virtual options. A couple of things that we're looking at proposing, we've talked to some legislators about, a Good Samaritan type protection for employers that make decisions in good faith to protect employees or essential operations. Many employers are confused about not only state guidelines about business operations and changing labor and benefit laws, but also about the CDC guidance. Every scenario is different, and a lot of the pressure is put on companies to make game time decisions to protect employees. We're looking to see if the state can declare some type of Good Samaritan protection for companies against labor and discrimination laws or potential personal lawsuits. Also, we're looking to deregulate or potentially obtain waivers for short-term or immediate needs to provide move production. As I mentioned just a moment ago, we're going to be needing to work with each other to try and support essential programs and potentially shift work or shift resources. Most likely, the large medical device OEMs such as Medtronic can get special support or waivers from the FDA, but most manufacturers that are smaller and don't necessarily have those connections can't necessarily make that happen quickly. As most or many of you know, in normal times, regulated products may take 6 months or more to revalidate and obtain approval on a process or location change, and of course would be devastating in these times. There are also labor laws, collusion laws, insurance conflicts, and challenges with contracts and employee benefits that would make it extremely tough to exchange work, labor, or shared resources between companies. We're hoping the state and federal governments will either open up some of these regulations, or again offer some type of a Good Samaritan type law that allows companies to do what is right in the best interest of our nation in order to keep clearly essential projects moving. On to our main topic. Today, related to what I just mentioned, we're focused on supply chain solutions to help you ensure your essential partnerships can keep moving. Tom Sellen is the Vice President of Business Development at King Solutions, a logistics provider based out of Dayton, Minnesota. Tom?
I've been around the manufacturing sector for about 40 years. And like all of you, I just have nothing to compare the current events to. Contingencies that we've all worked on were about natural disasters, cybersecurity, all things that were had a definitive end. So our company's working through the current situation, and I've also been in contact with many of our providers. So we've been in contact with a construction, ventilation industry, sporting goods, print and mail, medical supplies, devices, scrapbooking, pet food. Those make up a large share of the businesses that I work with. Steve, you want to move ahead? So the agenda today, we're going to talk a little bit about safety in the workplace. We're going to cover some supply chain action plan, talking about implementing a safe material handling action plan, a little bit about the impact on transportation. We'll provide some transportation information resources. We're going to talk a little bit about outside the box supply chain partnerships. Steve had mentioned some of those in his presentation. I'd like to expand on that a little bit. We're going to talk about resources for finding capacity or needing capacity. Again, that's a little bit redundant with what Steve presented. We're going to talk a little bit about essential services, and then we'll finish this up by talking about surviving the storm. What is what happens later after this is done? Steve, you want to move ahead? So safety in the workplace. These are extraordinary times, and I think a lot of the moves that you're forced to take or need to take would have probably sounded ridiculous 6 months ago. These are extraordinary times. I think you need to be bold about it. So the number one thing, one of the important things is there should be no visitors unless absolutely essential need. What does absolutely essential need mean? Do you even need a receptionist? Should anybody be entering your building? Number two, can you isolate essential visitors if you have them from contact with employees, particularly with multiple employees? Number three, there should be no direct contact with delivery agents or drivers. That's for their protection and yours. We're going to talk a little bit about that when we get to the transportation piece. But find ways to interact with delivery agents and drivers that don't involve personal contact or very minimal contact. You will see some old rules that you've had about signing bill of ladings and for receipts of delivery. Ask the drivers to sign them for you. That's probably very acceptable in these extreme times. Of course, you've all thought about providing sanitizer stations throughout your facilities. That's very common with the manufacturers I've talked to. Provide gloves, masks, and protective wear where you can. Do some screening to remove anyone with potential risk. There's a wide array of how that is done. Some of it's done by just telling employees that don't feel well to stay home. In some more extreme situations, people are certainly using electronic devices to measure temperatures. Isolate work groups and rotate shifts to minimize exposure. Do you have work groups that don't need to be in your facility at the same time? I have talked with a couple of manufacturers that work groups that do the same work, but they're never in the facility together. They're in a facility at different times. And then while they're there, of course, they're practicing social distancing, but it's a way to minimize your risk. And last but not least, if you haven't thought about it already, do you have employees who are not typically in a production role that could help you? The perfect example I can think of, two perfect examples. You have salespeople who really can't call on anybody right now anyway. Could they be helpful in your production area? Do you really need a receptionist right now? Is that a person that potentially could move to a production role? And in doing this, especially if you're busy, all these measures can be very helpful to help you avoid situations where you have to bring in day labor or temporary labor, because those people are not necessarily always in your culture. It's a way to mitigate some risk. See if you can move ahead. So when you talk about your supply chain plan, a lot of times people are talking about contingencies that are inside their building. They're focused on what happens when material gets to them and throughout the process, who touches it. But you really need to expand your supply chain plan to include where it's coming from and where it's going to. Does your contingency plan and action plan for possible virus spread account for having to relocate your work to another facility? It has to be overcome contractual and regulatory obstacles. Stephen mentioned something about that as well. There is some legislative help to be able to place work elsewhere. You also need your supply chain action plan to include your suppliers. You need to understand their plans and contingencies, and you need to be able to align with alternative resources if needed. Transportation providers, couriers, delivery agents all have to come into a collaborative plan for your action plan. And you need to be able to protect your customers and clients. Certainly at the end of the day, understanding their plan and making sure your contingency plan falls into that. Steve, go ahead. So your COVID-19 material handling plan needs to take into account when your various materials your staff will be handling. Do you have an understanding of how long the virus could potentially survive on those materials? I think also take into account how they're received. Are they shipped at pallet level? Do people actually touch the material, or is it just offloaded by forklifts? Understand the amount of time that has passed since the material has been handled prior to approval, prior to arrival. What has happened in transport? Not only when it was loaded by your supplier, but what has happened to it in transit. So you need to have some critical communications with your suppliers and your supply chain providers, your transportation people, regarding their handling protocols, so that you take all of those into account. And of course, any measures you can take on your end relative to that for disinfecting materials, handling, hand washing, protection, all of those things that are covered under the guidelines. Steve, talk a little bit about trucks. Driving a truck is a lonely job right now, and that's because they have less places they can stop to rest. They're not accustomed to going into a place like King Solutions, for example. When a truck driver in normal times comes into our facility, they're welcome. They come into a lobby. They get some interaction with employees or with the people in the dispatch area. Even though it's a high secure facility, they still have a place they can go. We've taken the extreme measures of just doing what we can. They don't even have to come in. We don't allow them in. So we take some very extreme measures to provide documents to them in their trailers or in drop boxes. They have interaction through a speaker device out in the yard or on cell phones. Don't have any interaction directly with employees right now. the number one bullet point there, understand where trucks can go and where they can deliver. So we'll talk a little bit about that. As you send trucks from your facility in normal times, you have the comfort of knowing that the consignee at the other end is open, they're ready to receive. We've taken the extreme measure of calling every consignee we send a shipment to make sure they're open. Even if they're essential services, we still have to verify they're open before that shipment ever leaves your dock or our dock, to make sure that our shipment doesn't get there and then not have a plan for it at that point. A little bit about the impact of Department of Transportation hours of service. For those of you that are familiar with hours of service, truck drivers the regulations for truck drivers increased over time, all done for safety. They'd limit the hours they can typically drive. There's a lot of regulations put in place. Also the devices to monitor where they're at. Those regulations were rolled back recently in response to COVID-19. So the new hours of service, is a truck driver can drive just about as long as they want to at this point. But when they stop, then they are mandated a 10-hour break. But they're able to drive a lot farther, get places a lot quicker than they have. And those are only for loads of material nationwide that is covered under essential services. A little bit of why transportation costs are becoming more difficult to predict. Well, picture yourself back 3-4 months ago sending a truckload of something to Madison, Wisconsin. And your truck driver would go to Madison, Wisconsin. He would slip to us the town nearby, and he'd easily be able to find a load of something going somewhere else. Those have changed in the marketplace dramatically because only essential services product can be moved by these transportation providers out of that area. So the driver or the truck line has an increased cost of having to travel some other place to pick up another essential load. That's driven the cost of moving a truckload from Minneapolis to Wisconsin from, maybe what used to be $900, maybe up to $1,200, maybe a 25% increase. So it varies dramatically by what states you're shipping to, what cities you're shipping to, how many essential services products are moving. Next thing on the list, really understand your supplier's protocols for releasing shipments so that they align with yours. Your supplier may be in another state that is or isn't covered under essential, or isn't covered under shelter in place. You need to understand that. And then what are your protocols for receiving shipments and materials? How does that work and how does that differ from 2 months ago? Down to your protocols for shipping product, calling consignees. Back to my comment earlier, I'd recommend that no one sends a shipment anywhere without someone calling ahead to make sure that it's able to be delivered and there's somebody there to receive it. And I think the last bullet point on there, something to keep in mind is, when your product is picked up, you may understand the protocol of the person that shipped it, what their safety protocols are, how they've done to keep your materials from being exposed. But do you understand really what has happened to your material en route? Is it coming directly on a truck, or is it an LTL shipment where somebody has to handle it a number of times before it ever gets to your location? Just need to take those things into account as you're developing your COVID-19 plan. Steve? Here are a few transportation information resources you're welcome to use. These are links on here. These are all related to supply chain information providers. And you're free to use those links. I believe they're all free resources. There are some places where you can log in to get additional information. But this tells you a lot about the transportation industry and the updates what's going on in terms of the COVID-19 response as well. Go ahead, Steve, you can move to the next one. This is a slide that Steve and I looked at this morning, a snapshot by the it actually comes from the Transportation Industry of America. This is an outline of, it says freight disruptions, but these are exact states where that have been declared as stay in place states. And of course, the transportation is disrupted there. So trucks can travel to those yellow states. Trucks can sure travel and they can ship, you know, they're not covered under essential services. They can ship things from there. But when they get to the states where they're being, you know, the states that are covered under the shelter in place, you know, is there something that, you know, can it be delivered? It probably can't be delivered unless it is something covered under essential services. So that is the current outline. Steve went over some of this. I just want to talk about it. Just couldn't be more important at this time that you may want to take the extreme approach of looking at your neighbor down the road who's also your competitor. You know, can you collaborate with them on materials order? Can you share, you know, outside the box? Can you share raw materials inventory with them? Is that an opportunity for partnership at this time? Are you together with them on a collaboration strategy of any type, possibly even sharing, you know, production resources? And do you have a production contingency plan that covers or that includes your partners, your neighbors, and your competitors?
One thing, I'll interrupt for a second, if you don't mind, Tom. Well, I want to be clear too that we're very careful to not be suggesting anything that would be considered collusion or anti-competitive activities. So that's, again, one thing I mentioned earlier is that we're going to be working with the hopefully state and federal governments to find ways to protect manufacturers who are trying to work together for the better good. But of course, we need to be careful about things that are currently illegal as far as, again, anti-competitive or anti-collusion activities.
Sounds good. You can move ahead, Steve. And I think these are resources that Steve already shared. You can pass this slide up if you want, Steve. Steve also covered a lot about the essential services, but just at a high level, you know, making yourself as an essential service. You know, can you modify or produce a product category as essential? Can you partner with a manufacturer producing essential need products to utilize your company assets? And I think I want to extend that to perhaps it's warehouse space, and you know, maybe it's something other than actually producing. Maybe it's helping to distribute. You know, it could be, again, it could be services that are related as long as there's something covered under the movement of essential services. You can move ahead, Steve. So kind of takes me round to this, you know, decisions that you're going to need to make. What does after the storm look like? What does the aftermath look like? What does it mean to your future? And you know, sure, a couple tidbits of information. So we'll kind of start with, you know, is your operation staying open or is it temporary closing? We've got clients that are on both ends of that. We've got clients that are the need for their product, even if it's essential, has fallen off, and they have elected to close temporarily. We've got clients where their production is about where it was, no real major change in what they're doing. And then we've got clients where their business is just booming, and it's not necessarily in sectors you would have thought about. So is there something you can do in surviving this to protect your customers, to avoid losing clients? Is there something you can do to maintain your workforce? Modifying your production line to remain open, leveraging your available financial resources. But the one I want to talk about is just, I want to add on to the end here about understanding and planning for the inevitable changes in consumer buying habits. Let me tell you where that comes from. You can all relate to toilet paper. I have friends in the pet food business. We have one of them that, actually all of them, but one of them in particularly, where we shipped out about 1 million pounds last week of pet food to replenish pet food on shelves in small and large stores. They wind up going to DCs that replenish those stores. If you're in the pet food business, you feed your dog the same brand all the time. When you go into a store to buy your product and the shelf is empty, the odds are pretty good that you're going to buy a competitor's brand, and then you might stay with that. So the risk is extreme, particularly in that type of business. And so there is a huge rush to get product produced and fill those shelves back up. Now that's going to level out, we all know, because the pets are only going to eat so much food at the end of the day. But that's a reality right now. We are shipping massive amounts of pet food, and I'm sure that's happening obviously in the food industry as well. The second thing I want to talk about is understanding the shift in consumer buying habits itself. There will be a huge shift from retail stores to e-com. It has happened in this. It's happened in this testing period, but it's going to be long term because people are realizing how nice it is to go to your front step and pick up your bag of pet food. We have seen e-com business jump by as much as 500% over what it was 2 months ago. And again, it's a sign of the times. People are there's going to be less retail stores in some industries. If this is going to force some small retail outlets out of business or into a different business model. So anyway, just sharing that with you, if you could think ahead of what that might do with your business. Steve, I think you can move ahead, and that might be all I got.
Sure. Thanks, Tom. One thing I know, Tom kind of covered some of the stuff that I had earlier, and I purposely wanted to cover that a couple times because I think right now the most important thing, as Tom mentioned in his last slide, his last note, is prepare for the inevitable. I think we all know that we are going to see an employee get sick. We are going to have to make a decision about the half a dozen or dozen employees around that employee, if we need to quarantine, if we need to shut down areas of our facilities, or if we need to shut down an entire facility. Those things are going to happen with a moment's notice, and we're going to have to make tough decisions. So, I know of a few companies that are already taking proactive measures, companies that are partnering with each other, again, maybe competitors or neighbors, but proactively just opening up that line of communication and talking to each other, to your supply chain, to your backup supply chain, to your customers. Assume that at any given moment you're going to have to make a decision, and you're going to have to figure out how to shift work or how to keep something going. So I think that's probably the biggest takeaway from today is really look at your supply chain, not just from is everyone open or if they can ship your product, but also what's your backup plan, and who are you communicating with. So I guess with last few minutes here, if you want to open up to any questions anyone has, if you haven't already, if you want to go ahead on the chat log and enter any questions you have, I'd be happy to share. Otherwise, we can also get back to them later. I don't think we've got anything entered in yet, Tom. So if you do have any follow-up questions, feel free to reach out to Tom or MPMA. My contact information is on our website, as well as you can reach out to CMMA and Tri-State, and we'd be happy to help you and answer any questions. We appreciate you guys joining us today. If you are interested, we have a webinar this Thursday. It actually kind of goes hand in hand with today's topic. Thursday's webinar is going to be on more specific applications of cleaning and certain precautions and actual solutions to cleaning product and to making sure your workplace is properly cleaned, and not only proactive measures but also reactive measures if there is a positive case. So we hope you can join us on Thursday morning. Otherwise, we appreciate you joining us today. We hope you and your work and home families are all doing well, and we look forward to talking to you and hopefully seeing you again soon. Take care. Thank you.